From the Warhammer Imperium magazine, collected short stories narrated by J.H. Miniatures. At the request of Inquisitor Draxos, Vengeful Hunters. It is well that the Eldari are few in number, for were they to match us pilot for pilot, the Imperium would meet its doom swiftly. Their ace pilots make even the greatest Imperial pilot look like a sluggish oaf. Woe to the pilot who faces a Crimson Hunter alone. Rickard von Bader, ace pilot. Drukhari raiders have descended on a maiden world to torture and plunder. A trio of Crimson Hunters, Eldari aspect warriors and expert pilots, streak through the skies, tasked with defending the pristine planet from the twisted denizens of Comora. Avanus adjusted the throttle of his Nightshade Interceptor, the agile vessel's acceleration pushing him back into his seat. His slender fingers danced across the control panel, instinctively adjusting aerodynamic flaps on the fighter's wraithbone wings. The interior of his psycho-reactive helm flashed as the vessel's sensors transmitted sensory data. The enemy were out there somewhere, beyond the cloud cover. Drukhari. He sneered inside his helm as he thought of his twisted kin. The fell denizens of Comora had dared to befoul the surface of this maiden world, and now they would pay for their arrogance. The Crimson Hunters had arrived, and now the dance of death would begin. At his right wingtip, the Exarch's vessel adjusted its flight pattern, nose tipping towards the planet's surface. Avanus needed no further command from his superior. He pressed the yoke of his flight stick down and followed the Exarch into a steep dive. At his left wing, the third of the Crimson Hunters followed suit. Together, the trio of fighters scythed through the cloud cover, bursting from their hiding place to descend upon the invading Drukhari. Rolling tracts of forest covered the surface of the maiden world, the tallest of the trees reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. The planet's beauty had been scarred, however. Large tracts of forest had been burned away, and the angular, razor-edged forms of Drukhari vessels could be seen hovering above the devastation. Beneath the vessels of his dark kin, Avanus could see flashes of gunfire. At least some of the planet's exodite Eldari still lived. Inside the visor of Avanus' wraithbone helmet, warning runes flashed brightly, alerting him to a potential threat. His fellow pilots had read the signal too. The Exarch's voice filtered over the helmet's communication unit. Razor wings northwest. Avanus adjusted his stick and banked his interceptor towards the threat. Below the trio of Eldari fighters, the jet-black silhouettes of a trio of Drukhari razor-wing jet fighters rose from the forest cover, the yellow flare of their engines visible as they thundered towards their craft-world foes. The fighters closed with one another at breakneck speed, the blinding light of Eldari bright lances clashing with the inky blackness of Drukhari dark lances. Avanus' eyes narrowed, his mind entering a trance-like state of battle meditation. Gone was conscious thought, now all was muscle memory, raw reflexes and ingrained training. Avanus' canopy darkened, shielding his eyes from the searing brightness of his own fighters' bright lance weapons. Pilots, both Drukhari and Eldari, jinked and manoeuvred their supersonic craft, minuscule adjustments to ailerons and wing flaps pivoting their steeds just enough to avoid incoming fire. Avanus guided his fighter through the Drukhari formation, rolling his interceptor upside down, sweeping past the enemy so close that he could have reached out and touched the nearest razor-wing fighter. Yanking upon his flight stick, Avanus guided his fighter up into a loop, rolling the vessel as he did so. The Drukhari pilots had divided, each peeling away to distract and divide their Eldari opponents. Avanus focused in upon one of the Drukhari vessels, the blade-like wings of which had been adorned with the obscene runes of whichever cruel cabal the pilot belonged. Bone relics and tattered hide had been crudely nailed to the hull, betraying the vile nature of its pilot. The Drukhari vessel dove towards the forest, weaving in and out of the trees in an attempt to shake Avanus from its tail. Possessed of preternatural reflexes, the Drukhari pilot guided his vessel through a tangled mess of vines, towering trees and abandoned Eldari ruins. A pilot of any other race may well have abandoned the pursuit, or been dashed to smithereens. Avanus, however, had spent centuries honing his skills in the shrine of his craft world, and he matched the death-defying agility of his target with ease. Pushing hard on the throttle, Avanus gunned his interceptor forwards and into a roll, barely avoiding the looming mass of a towering tree. Ahead, the engines of the Razor-Wing jet fighter flared as it increased speed once more and began to climb out of the forest canopy. Avarnus pulled the nose of his fighter up sharply, G-forces pressing down on his body. The targeting runes on his helmet flared brightly, reticled settling over the Drukhari vessel's canopy. He opened fire, underslung bright lance emitting a beam of searing energy that punched directly through the Razor-Wing's clear canopy, reducing the Drukhari pilot to charred ruins. Deprived of its pilot, the Razor-Wing continued to climb for a few brief seconds before its engines died and it plummeted to the ground trailing smoke. Seconds later, a violent explosion rocked the forest as the stricken vessel's fuel supply ignited, emitting a cloud of smoke and fire. Avarnus directed his interceptor away from the conflagration and up into the light. Kill confirmations flooded his display, his fellow pilots reporting their targets destroyed. More warning runes flashed in his peripheral vision, this time in their dozens. As one, the Crimson Hunters turned towards the incoming foes. Their work was not yet done. So there you go. So that makes a nice change, doesn't it? I mean, to be fair, now it looks like we've got a series of short stories until... is it this one? Festering Hordes, story 15. And that is... yeah, there's another 2-page one as well. So what does this tie into? Because I know a lot of people are going to be looking at this and going, right, well, we've had Necrons, we've had Space Marines, we've had Adeptus Mechanicus, we've had all that. We've even had Chaos. But all of a sudden we've got Eldari and Drukhari. So, you know, I'm not going to talk to you guys as if you don't know what these are. You know they're Eldar and Dark Eldar. I think in terms of reading them, it'll always be a bit weird. It's like saying Astra Militarum. It'll always be a bit weird than saying that compared to Imperial Guard or Eldar or Dark Eldar, because that's what they're known as. That's their names. But these are copyrightable, aren't they? I really struggle. Where's that word? Maneuver their supersonic craft minuscule adjustments to ailerons. Ailerons? A-I-L-E-R-O-N-S. Ailerons. And wing flaps. It's got to be something to do with adjusting the height and the I don't know, the pivot of the plane or something like that. But what a word out of left field to just have thrown at you, and you're like, oh well, sod, how do I read this? How do I pronounce this word? It's not like a 40k name. They're mostly legible for the most part. Avarnus. But no, it was quite nice reading about the Eldar and the Dark Eldar going at it. This 100%, without a shadow of a doubt, would tie into their Aeronautica Imperialis. You know, the fighter plane game that they made that's going to be tied up into the epic Horus Heresy game that's now coming out. Yeah, because who cares about flying planes against one another? But this story would have come from that, so it's quite nice to have it included here, because otherwise this would just be lost to time. And more often than not, plane like dogfights, we don't get many of those. Like not in this like 40k science fiction. More often than not, it's the boots on the ground, it's the tanks, it's the spaceships, it's all that. It doesn't tend to be the air forces, so it is quite nice to have a story about them. I think they could have talked more about the weapons other than just bright lances and dark lances. Like there were no stakes reading this. I think the closest he got was the flying through the trees. Like there was like it seemed like they got the jump on the Razor Wings and just destroyed them. That was it. That's the story. Like they could have done something there. I don't know. These stories they're a real hard one because 40k is about fighting. There's no doubt about it. But then you look at the most popular stories and it's the diplomacy side. But then how are you meant to do that in a magazine that's all about the conflict? It's all about the fighting and the killing. But it is quite weird to see how some releases got tied into it, because I know the magazine released one, like the Black Templars line was released. So anyway, I'm just waffling on about nothing now. Go on, that's us done for this week. I'll see you all in a bit. Thanks again for watching. Bye bye.